Our featured speaker tonight is Stephen Davis. He's a professor of political science and environmental studies at Edgewood University, and he's the author of In Defense of Public Lands, The Case Against Privatization and Transfer. So, Stephen, take it away.
All right. I am going to share some slides I have, and just give me 1 minute. Okay, I am indeed the author of that book, but I'm here actually to talk about my latest book, which is called The Other Public Lands, which is about state public land. And 1 second.
That looks good.
Okay. Whoops. There we go. So, why did I write this book? And it's because nearly every last academic book written, PBS special film, car decal applied, has been focused in the last century, has been focused on our very glorious and deserving federal public lands. Although state public land is what people visit and recreate in most, and it has never been the subject of a single book length comprehensive treatment. And so I decided I was going to try to remedy that with my latest book, which came out earlier this year, and also in Temple University Press. So it's about kind of the politics of managing state public lands and sort of a database of what the 50 state systems were. It took me a couple of years to pull together all this data. So in a nutshell, if you look to the pie chart to the left, there's about 200 million acres of state land as compared to about the 630 or so million acres of federal land. So it's about a third of the federal system, although that's a bit misleading. That's 9% of the whole United States. But that's a bit misleading in that, if you look over at that chart, 45%, 87.9 million acres, is part of Alaska's 1959 state grant. So when they became a state in 1959, they were just given an enormous chunk of land just for being Alaska. And that is really different than all other types of state land. And this book is not actually about that, because it can be given away, it can be shared with tribes, it can be given to local governments, it can be given to corporations. It's kind of unrestricted. There's no rules about how it is used. And Alaska carved their own systems out of that, like state parks and state forests. But what was left was 87, 88 million acres. And that just kind of sitting there uncategorized. What the book is about is the other stuff, the 61 million acres of agency land and 49 million acres, what we call institutional trust lands, or often called school trust lands. So the agency lands are things we're most familiar with: state parks, state forests, state wildlife refuges. And then the trust lands exist mostly out west, and they have a fascinating history. They are our oldest public lands, going back to the 1795 Northwest Ordinance. And that law laid out the process by which new states were to be explored, mapped, and added to the Union. And part of that said, so Lewis and Clark, they kind of head out west, and they kind of measure all these latitude and longitude lines. And from those latitude and longitude lines, we divided up America into what we call townships. In some places in Wisconsin, we call them towns, but townships. And they are 6 miles by 6 miles. And the whole country is just a checkerboard of these 6 by 6 mile townships. And the Northwest Ordinance said one of them, the 16th section. So sections are these 1 square mile chunks, about 640 acres. One section of every township had to be given from the federal government when they gave the state, when it became a state and they gave it its grant, would go to the state to support the public schools, because there was no property in the world, on the frontier. And so they couldn't have property taxes. This was an attempt to give them some means so they would rent it for farming or log it or whatever to raise money. Starting with Ohio in 1803, every new state from Ohio on got this federal land as a grant. And they quickly squandered it. Most sold it off really quickly. And so Congress wasn't happy about that. And they changed the law, tightened the rules. And that is why most state trust land is west of the Mississippi. The eastern states kind of squandered it. Congress tightened the rules, and the western states still have most of it. Now, as you go west, the land's more arid. And so Congress, with subsequent state grants, they gave two, the 36th and the 16th, they gave two sections in each township to western states because it was harder to raise resources. And then for the driest, most arid states, New Mexico, Utah, and Arizona, they gave 4 sections. And so that's where state trust lands come. And they were given in these weird little checkerboard patchworks. Ironically, the Utah and the New Mexico lands are filled with gas and oil and minerals, and they earn those states outrageous amounts of money. So I'm not going to bombard you with, well, I am going to bombard you with a lot of data, but we're not going to go through it all. This is simply a look at where state land is. These are the 50 states ranked by how much of the state is state-owned, owned by the state government. And Hawaii is the leader. And what you find are some really surprising places. The state land superpowers are New Jersey. Who would have thought that? 17.6% of the state is public land, state public land. Minnesota, Florida, New York, Pennsylvania. The US average is 8.8, but if you take out Alaska, that Alaska grant, it's around 5. And then some states like Kansas and Texas and Kentucky, they have very, very little. And then the map there is just by shading. So the darkest states are between 10 and 37% of the land mass is state owned. So you can see it's all over the map. There's that same map again. And why state land is so important is that it's geographically distributed way more evenly. Federal land, of course, is overwhelmingly west of the 100th meridian. And state land there's a lot of it out east. There's a lot of it in Florida. There's a lot of it, in the Northwest and the upper Midwest. And so it is not only distributed more evenly, it is way more heavily visited. So you can see in these figures, just comparing national and state parks, national park system is almost 85 million acres with a quarter billion visits. That comes out to three visits per acre. And state parks are about 15 million acres with 730,000 visits, or almost 50 visits per acre. So that's almost 3 times the visitation on only 17% of the land. That is 16 times more visits proportionally. So this is where it is estimated 1/3 of all outdoor recreation takes place. So state lands are really important to the average American, especially those east of the Rocky Mountains. So I'm just going to really quickly run you through the different types of state land, and then I want to talk about some challenges and then talk about land transfer and why I think that would be a terrible idea, transferring from states to the federal government, or other way around, from the federal government to the states. So state parks only make up, if you don't count the Alaska grant, they only make up about 14% of state public lands. So that's actually not a whole lot. Sorry about that. I'm getting my my view blocked here, so I'm trying. There we go. Okay, and so they don't make up a ton of state land, but they are what most people think of. And in some ways, they're almost ubiquitous or congruent with the term state public land. That's where most visitation occurs, is on the state parks. So the median state park system is about 250,000 acres. I'm sorry, the mean, the average, but there's some huge ones like New York and California. So the median, kind of the middle case, is about 118,000 acres. So not very big, but they are so heavily visited. New York is special. There's if you see that term, special status parks, 3 states, 3 parks, Catskills, Adirondacks, and Baxter Park in Maine, are outside of their regular state park systems. So they exist. I call them special status parks. New York's are in the Constitution, and Baxter was given by a former governor on this kind of separate deed as a gift to the state. And it was never incorporated by the deed. It can't be incorporated into the state park system. So these exist as very large. That's where Mount Katahdin is. And they exist as very large kind of special wilderness chunks of land. They're about 3 million acres altogether. And you can see at Adirondacks how enormous it is. It has this unusual zone where there's private and public land. You see that map. The green is the publicly owned land. The dark green is wilderness. The white is private land, but that's the boundaries. And within that boundaries, it's a lot more regulation than outside the boundary. So you could see Yellowstone and Yosemite and Glacier. They all fit inside the boundaries of that size park. It's the largest single park in the United States. But those are unusual. Most parks and park systems are much smaller. And you can see the Northeast and Florida are in California on the West Coast are the places with the most parks. So the state park's origins in what we call the state parks movement was really closely tied to the development of the national parks and the ideology of the national parks. They kind of go hand in hand. They're the little sibling of the national parks. Stephen Mather, in some ways, is the father of the national parks, but also of the state parks. He was being deluged with congressmen attempting to add new national parks. And some of them were, in his opinion, not up to snuff. They were important places, but he didn't want to dilute the growing and newly solidified national park system with every last place and every corner. But he realized people couldn't get out west to go to these great parks, especially back then without the interstate, mass transportation. So they came up with this motto, a state park every 100 miles. And he called a national conference of state parks. Now, some state parks are already starting, but his goal was to get these systems up and running in 50 states. Well, we didn't have 50 states back then, but in every state. And the National Park Service acted as sort of the consultant and provided seed money and all kinds of guidance. And what you got was a system that very much was a mirror and a kind of a mimic of the national park system. The next system I looked at in the book, chapter 3, is state natural areas. This is in state wilderness areas. These are the smallest systems. They only make up between 1% and 2% of state public lands. Only about 12 states have wilderness areas. New York has the largest, and the vast majority, 2/3 of that is just in New York and Alaska. But the ones on the right are the states with wilderness systems. Some of them are whole programs and systems, with just like the federal system, where you could name new places, you can add. Others are simply states that have a unit or a place protected as wilderness, so kind of a one-shot deal. Ohio's Shawnee Wilderness and Oklahoma's McCurtain Mountain Wilderness. These were just a very special place that the legislature protected at one time, and that's it. Either way, about 3.7 million acres of state wilderness. That's a tiny fraction of the federal system, which is like 115 million. But still, they kind of mirror the national system in a much smaller way. But very important in New York. The big majority of the Adirondack Park is protected in the Constitution as wilderness. And then state natural areas, Wisconsin and Illinois and Kentucky are the leaders there. State natural areas are just essentially really biodiverse places, or places with really special geography and natural features that are set aside often as an overlay. Like it'll be within a state forest or within a national park, but it's like an added level of protection, like an official designation. And there's about 3.2 million acres, not a lot at all, but these are some of the most precious and important repositories of biodiversity. So in that way, they are really, really important places. But you could kind of see these are the smallest, and that reflects the priorities of state policymakers. They're kind of the orphans of the system. Then you have the state version of our national forest system, state forests. And this is a much bigger system than national parks, about 19% of state public land. You see it is dominant in the northern tier of states, with the exception of Florida. Florida has a very large system. So Minnesota has a 4 million acre system. Michigan has almost 4 million acres. The states you would suspect, Pennsylvania, New York, Oregon, Wisconsin. And Wisconsin also has this parallel county forest system, which is kind of under law governed by the state, but it's owned by the counties. And if you add those, that's 2.3 million acres. Wisconsin is like in the top 3 or 4 states if you add in their county forest, public forest system. Anyway, state forests are very similar to national forests in that they are multiple use. But we'll talk about in a minute is how much harder they are used. Where they came from, most state forests, especially east of the Rockies, have their origins in the tax forfeitures that followed the cut and run logging, the rape of the northern forests around the turn of the century. Big companies came in, swooped in, took what they wanted and left burning stump fields around 1900, 1890, 1910. And they stopped paying taxes on it and just went to the Pacific Northwest when they were done with Michigan and Minnesota and Wisconsin. And these lands reverted to county ownership. The counties couldn't take them. So the states and the federal government, this is where also our federal national forests out east come from, the same origins, largely tax forfeitures. So Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, those are states that had large state forests from forfeiture. Another system, it's the largest of all the systems in state public land, are wildlife management areas. And these are somewhere between multiple use lands and preserved lands. It depends on the state, it depends on the unit. They also range, I should say, from absolutely glorious, biodiverse and pristine backcountry. The top picture there is the Bridgestone Firestone Centennial Wilderness in Tennessee, which is one of the finest state wildlife areas in the whole country, with old growth forests and these beautiful ridges and landforms. And then all the way to essentially grassy fields filled with, Eurasian meadow grasses and box elders, and they're just good forage for deer. And so there's everything from the most meh kind of land to some of the most spectacular state preserves and everything in between. They are all over the place. It is also a type of land that is very commonly leased. And so who do they lease land from? States lease land from the federal government around dams and reservoirs. Those are usually managed by states. They're owned by the Bureau of Reclamation, but the states have often for waterfowl, they have fairly large wildlife areas on leased land. They also lease from power companies and paper companies and large landowners. Some of that leased land is long-term, some of it comes and goes. So the total system is almost 40 million acres. States own about half of that, about 20.8 million acres. And state natural areas are found throughout the country, but some of the bigger areas, the upper Midwest and the South. Then the last system is these institutional trust lands. Now, school districts, K through 12, are the largest beneficiaries. This is a system of legal beneficiaries that this trust has a fiduciary relationship to. They must raise money and use the land for the highest bidder to raise money for the schools, or sometimes it's mental health, public hospitals or mental health systems, occasionally universities, but most of it goes to schools. And remember the grants, the 460 acre 1 square mile grants. This is what it looks like on the ground. This is a close-up picture of a portion of Emery County, Utah. And the green area, or it's not green, but the solid areas are national forests. And you can see there's some inholdings because the national forest was established with those grants already inside of them. So obviously the states can't use those well because they're surrounded by other land. Sometimes it's national parks and you really can't access them and drill for oil and stuff. So what the government tries to do, the federal government tries to trade, and over time Utah's traded a lot of land. You see that big chunk of trust land up there, consolidated. It's way easier to manage consolidated land. And so they trade, and the federal government gives them BLM land, and they let the federal government have those inholdings that are stuck inside of federal land. So state trust lands, I call them the sort of public lands because in a lot of states, you're not even allowed to use them without a permit or without special permission. They are not public land quite in the way that a state park or state wildlife area is public. Sometimes when a lease is made, it is only the person who buys the lease, the company or the farmer or whoever buys the lease, who has access to the land. And there is, again, this kind of constitutional, some states put it in their constitution, a fiduciary duty to raise money from the highest bidder. And so this is really hard land to take care of, to have any kind of conservation protection purposes. A few states, California and Colorado, have been at the forefront of trying to incorporate conservation into these lands. But most Western states, it is just, these lands are pounded pretty hard. And they're the biggest system. You can see where they're located. The Western mountain states have the most. Out east, Minnesota has a fair amount. But east of the Mississippi, it is just Alabama, Mississippi, and Wisconsin that retain any of their trust lands. Wisconsin has about 77,000 acres left. But the Western states have 2 and 3 and 4 million acre systems. So in states like Arizona, it's the biggest, it's like 95% of all public land is trust land. They have tiny little park systems. Of course, they have really large federal land mass, but tiny little park systems. That's probably why they have so few state parks, is because they feel, they're so full of national parks and national forests. They don't feel the same heat as, say, New Jersey or New York, which has almost no federal land. Okay, so that's a quick review of what our state land systems look like. But now I want to talk about how they're managed and the reality of these systems. What they all share, with very few exceptions, a few states are the exception here, but is a context of fairly extreme austerity and an expectation of self-sufficiency. For example, across the US, all park budgets added together comprise only 1/1600 of 1% of total state budgets. Almost nothing is spent on state parks. And I would make the argument that they are so valuable, they pump so much into their local economies, that this is just completely short-sighted, penny-wise, pound-foolish, quite idiotic budgeting on state lawmakers' parts. So for each type of land, I want to show you how this plays out, how different types of public land are affected by this austerity. In state parks, it means revenue generation, entrance fees, recreation fees, fees for just about everything. I can camp in the Nicolet-Chequamegon National Forest in Wisconsin for $5 to $10 a night. If I go to a state park, it's $20 to $25 a night. And this is common across the country. Some state park passes systems have passes that are in the $200 and $300 range, like California, a year. And so parks are constantly looking to monetize whatever they can and raise fees. In a few states, like sadly my own state of Wisconsin, South Carolina, New Hampshire, have cut parks off entirely from the state budget. They have to raise all their own money, which is a losing proposition. You can maybe go a decade or so until your parks will be run into the ground, unless you do this to them, unless you turn them into something that is not a park. And a lot of states, especially in the South and the Ohio Valley, have this need for revenue has led states to try to monetize everything and reorient their parks away from low impact nature-based activities, hiking, bird watching, photography, towards these high-end and really environmentally impactful amenities like resorts and conference centers and golf courses and ski resorts and stables and RV type electrified campgrounds and marinas, and you name it. There are park systems that are moving in that direction. So if you need revenue, what kind of revenue model incentivizes you to protect biodiversity or quiet solitude or wilderness? How do you squeeze revenue out of this? By definition, it is, it's a public good and it needs public money to support it, like a library does or a K through 12 school does. We don't expect schools to pay for themselves. We don't expect, fire departments to, raise their own revenue, but we somehow expect parks to. And that means that places like this are on the losing end, or situations like this, untainted biodiversity loses out to something you could raise fees off of. This was a park in Kansas, the state of Kansas, Elk City State Park, and this tendency leads to super developed parks, and you can see the boundaries are in white. And so, is there any room for nature in that park? Right there in the middle of that road loop is a little tiny trail. I think you could walk a loop with your dog, maybe, but that's a state park. This intense mishmash of infrastructure, roads, parking lots is basketball courts, etc., fishing docks, more basketball, 2 basketball courts, passes for a state park. So state parks are really different in this regard, and some stay pretty primitive, including my own state, Utah, New Mexico, Montana. Alaska doesn't have a single electrified campsite in their entire state park system. And the states, mostly in the Ohio Valley and the Great Plains, are the most developed. So I developed this recreation orientation score. I literally counted up all the facilities, basketball courts, swimming pools, golf courses in the parks, and sort of made an equation based on their acreage. And created this orientation, this 0 to 1 orientation score, recreation orientation score. And you can see they're really clustered in the Great Plains and the Ohio River. Now, moving on to state forest, how does this austerity affect them? Well, it translates into a need for a steady flow of revenue. And here you raise it not through recreation, you raise it through multiple use. So fracking, mining, logging, and those are the things that pay the bills, not hiking and bird watching and biodiversity. And remember, states, unlike the federal government, cannot engage in deficit spending. And so that puts extra pressure to not be able to have debt, puts on extra pressure to balance budgets, which at the federal level, we haven't quite had in the same way. And so federal budgets can be a little looser. And up until just recently, they've been much more forgiving of spending at the federal level in public land. Much more forgiving, I should say, of paying for biodiversity, paying for low impact usages. States are much more like, hey, how is this land earning its keep? So I collected a lot of data and compared to national forests. And if you look at that map of Michigan, you see the national forests and state forests are all crammed side by side. They're the same land with the same kind of trees and the same climate. Everything about them is the same, except who's making the decisions. And national forests are logged way more aggressively. If you look at that top chart, I have production in millions of board feet per 1,000 acres. And you can see the national forest system is 0.015, and the states are between 3 and, not even counting Washington, which is off the charts, the states are like 3 to 10 times more intense logging per 1,000 acres. Another way to look at, another way to look at it is below that, comparing Wisconsin and Minnesota state forests to Wisconsin and Minnesota national forests. Again, side by side, just like the Michigan map. And you can see these are cords harvested, a cord of wood, which is a different measure. My data happened to be in cords, but Wisconsin state forests are at 0.26 cords per acre, and Wisconsin national forests are 0.13 cords per acre. Minnesota state forests are 0.16 versus 0.07 for Minnesota national forests. Partly that low number because so much of Minnesota national forest is the boundary waters, which is protected from logging. It kind of takes a lot of land off the table. And then finally, look at the other chart, Oregon. State forests in Oregon make up 4% of the state's forest acreage. and 10% of its harvest. Oregon national forests are almost half of the forest acreage and only 14% of the harvest. And that just shows you how much harder state land is worked. It is much more aggressive. And the reason for this is federal law. National Environmental Policy Act, National Forest Management Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, all these national forest plans have to comply with these very powerful laws, which have a lot of requirements about logging next to rivers and logging for biodiversity, to protect biodiversity. Most importantly, though, under federal law, external groups have a guaranteed access to a policy process. They must be invited to the table. They have guaranteed kind of access. All the comment periods and all the scoping and vetting of what people have to say. And probably most importantly of all, they have guaranteed legal standing to go to court, which state forests do not. State forest law generally in most states does not guarantee. None of this is true in most states' forest planning processes. So in states with significant state and national forest land side by side, like Minnesota, Indiana, Pennsylvania, environmental groups in those states tend to put all their money and time and conservation efforts in the national forests in their states. They don't bother with their conservation efforts in state forests because they don't have as much success. They don't have a foothold. They can't go to court as easily. They can't be invited into forest planning processes as easily. They're kind of shut out. Same is true about resource production when it comes to oil and fracking and natural gas. Look at these Michigan state and national forests. Remember how close together they are. They're side by side. This is the same land with the same kind of reservoirs of gas and, shale plays and stuff like that. The national forests are about 3 million acres. The state forests are about 4 million acres. Both systems are huge and they're side by side. In 2012, federal government earned 1.4 million acres from royalties, leases, I should say, and the state earned 43.6 million acres. So per 1,000 acres, that's $11,000 versus $500. So again, the national forest is leaving a lot of stuff underground. They're working way more slowly. They're not, at least up until recently. This may all change in the Trump years, but up until recently, they have not as aggressively developed the resources in their forest. Lastly, in state wildlife areas, the need for revenue also distorts priorities and management. So most national wildlife refuges use revenue that comes from hunting and fishing licenses. And this is a problem because the number of hunters is declining. There's a demographic wall coming and there's fewer and fewer hunters each generation. And that's the main source of funding. But even when it is adequate in states with a lot of hunting, like Wisconsin or Minnesota or Montana, it really distorts wildlife agencies' management priorities. Popular game species are 2% of all species in the US, but they get 90% of the spending on wildlife refuges for management and population management. So the habitat needs of grouse or deer or pheasants, brushy areas for rabbits, those often take priority over, the very conservative needs of, mature forests of spotted owls, or in the Northwoods, fisher and martins who need big woods, neotropical migrant warblers and other vireos and such that need big undisturbed blocks of forest, not chopped up, clear-cutted patchworks. Carner blue butterflies, which have really specific habitat needs up in my part of the country. There's no hunting of these species. There's no call to manage the land for their well-being. It happens, but it's a lower priority. So in all cases, the need for money, because of inadequate budgets and really severe constraints, distorts management. Most controversy on wildlife management areas is when revenue isn't just from hunting and fishing tags, but it is supplemented by logging and oil. So for example, in Pennsylvania, 1/3 of all the oil leases, natural gas leases are on state wildlife areas. And they swear that this is compatible, but I mean, I'll leave that for you to decide. Also, logging. Now, these logging projects are often disguised as habitat improvement. And so here's a great example, that beautiful wilderness I showed you of old growth forest in Tennessee, the Bridgestone Firestone Centennial Wilderness. There was a proposal to log those areas, those colored areas, which were old growth forests. And the idea was to make the land better for grouse hunting. And there were other areas of pine plantations and some other fields where that easily could have been done. They just happened to decide that the oldest, most valuable oaks and hickory were the place this had to happen. This conversion to grasslands and brushland for the grouse had to happen there. Well, this land was so beloved and so heavily used and so vital to the tourist industry in the area that there was a real backlash, including chambers of commerce and normally quite, pillars of the community, not just the usual environmental suspects. Everyone cried out about this one. And it was actually blocked, thank goodness. But this is what often happens. There's been a lot of controversy in Minnesota wildlife areas because of timber quotas in old growth oak forests that produce tons and tons of acorns that are absolutely essential to the species there. And it's always wrapped up in, well, this is better for other species. And so wildlife management areas very controversially become places where logging becomes really tempting, because you could always mask it over with supposed habitat improvement, justifications. Last is the trust lands, and these are managed, as I said, almost exclusively for their duty to provide revenue for the beneficiaries, which is usually schools. Some states are so fanatic about this that they would not even permit bidding for conservation leases, even when those leases are the highest bid. So some areas have oil, some areas have timber. They have things that are really valuable. You can see that bar chart is where the revenue comes from in each state. But some states have really dry kind of, that patchwork of checkerboard of 1 square mile chunks that was given to them. It's just, there's nothing there. There's just dry grassland. And so they graze. That's sort of the default. The grazing causes way more damage than it earns. The grazing rates are super low out west. And sometimes conservation, environmentalists are willing to pay even more than a rancher would. Some states prevent that bidding, which actually violates the trust laws in some states. The trust obligations say close your eyes and take the highest bid from whoever for whatever reason. So that just shows you the extent to which resource users have kind of an iron grip on land managers. Okay, why does trust lands matter so much? Well, they're half of all state land are trust lands. And also, most importantly, perhaps, is that for the Western states, most gung-ho to transfer lands, federal lands, to their control, Utah, Idaho, to some extent, Arizona's toyed with this. The trust lands are the model they put forth on how they would manage the land. So if you don't like how trust lands are managed, you really wouldn't like how the BLM lands, which they would be transferred, the national forests that they would be transferred, they wouldn't be run as state forests. They'd be run as like the trust lands are run. And certainly Utah has admitted this. Utah has gamed out how they would do it. And a bunch of studies from these University of Utah professors, they found that Utah would be on the hook in $2025. They did the study in 2015, but in $2025, they'd be on the hook for almost $600 million. Now that costs the federal taxpayer $4 a person. That costs the Utah taxpayer $54. So that's an enormous burden. That is the cost of management, the cost of fire protection. The federal government does firefighting. Utah would have to do it. It would no longer would there be state revenue sharing, like the federal government does payment in lieu of taxes and revenue sharing with local communities. They would either have to cut off their local communities or pay for it themselves. So $600 million would need to be replaced per year. The only scenario where Utah has that money would be, according to the study, is if they managed manage the land for a maximum of oil, coal, and uranium production, all places, at all the time, in all cases, and only at the highest market prices, which they have no control over. That was the only scenario that got up to that amount, was log, mine, and dig up everything and get paid the highest market price, which you don't control. It was even worse in Idaho, because Idaho does not have minerals. Idaho has only timber. And in Idaho, the only scenario that worked was they were on the hook for somewhere between $81 to $151 million per year for a very small state in 2025 dollars. The only management scenario that covered that cost, where Idaho could pay that bill, which the federal government and federal taxpayers now pay, would be to log 1 billion board feet of Idaho timber annually. For comparison, the entire national forest system, 155 national forests from California to North Carolina, logs last year 2.8 billion. So you would have to log more than a third of what the entire US national forest system produces to pay that bill. So it would be a disaster. Otherwise, states just don't have the money. They don't even have the money barely to cover the systems they have now. They have to kind of hammer them to raise the revenue. If they were to take on federal land, I would guess they would probably sell a good chunk of it. And indeed, a more cynical take on the purpose of this isn't that states are going to manage it. It's that it's a multi-step process by which they say, no, it's staying public, don't you worry. And then a decade or two down the line, when they can no longer pay for it, it will be transferred. In fact, state trust land can be sold. And if you look at this chart, that's one of the uses. And Arizona has raised almost 95% of its trust revenue by selling land, usually near Phoenix, for development. So that's my, sorry, I'm going the wrong direction. That's my take on this, why this would be such a disaster. I have, it looks like maybe 5 more minutes, and then I'll take some questions from you, but I just want to leave you with this notion. The sad state of affairs for state public land. I want to step back and say this is a tremendous system. It is almost a third the size of federal land. It is in very important places. Some states do a magnificent job. California, New York, they have tremendous state park systems. They uphold great, they uphold their state lands with great care for biodiversity and public access and wilderness values. But for the most part, states are much more constrained actors. I'm glad the state system is there. Can they take on more? No. Should they pay more of their budgets than they do now? Absolutely. State lawmakers, policymakers tend, if you need to visualize it, look at that triangle. They tend to see the value of public land as that little gold sliver. In my first book, In Defense of Public Lands, I argue it's that blue, it's the blue triangle. It's mostly unseen and uncalculated. And I have all kinds of data in that book about how much, both in traditional economics and in ecosystem services, this land is worth. It's a treasure trove. And we call that public goods when things are worth a lot, but you can't get at the money like in a market sense. Like education is a public good. Fire protection is a public good. National defense is a public good. And I would argue everything that state public lands do is a public good. We pay for all those other things through tax dollars. We seem to think that state public land needs to be on its own. This is from my own state. So I'm one of the 3 states. Mine is one of the 3 states that completely cut their state parks off of funding, 100%. So they get $0 of state budgets towards yearly operations. The state legislature gave the Milwaukee Brewers almost $500 million for a new stadium. Now, I'm not saying that was a bad idea. It was 4,600 jobs, $327 million in economic impact. You might remember President Trump in his first term and Governor Scott Walker pledging $3 billion of state money for 13,000 jobs. This never happened. They didn't hit their benchmarks and it was scrapped. But that was the plan. They were willing to put up $3 billion of state taxpayer money to bring 13,000 jobs to southeastern Wisconsin for a LED television screen manufacturing. Wisconsin State Park Systems they support 8,251 jobs and earn almost $1 billion in annual economic impact, according to a UW-DNR joint study per year, and they get nothing. That's how legislators tend to think of state parks. Given their job creation record, and if you use the logic that state representatives used in the Foxconn deal per job, the state park budget should be $1.9 billion in Wisconsin. Instead, it's zero. So penny wise and pound foolish. That's all I have for you. If you are interested in that, some of the data and the tables and my arguments about state land, I was given permission to offer this to you on this discount, which was extended. So this book is $30 from Temple University Press. And if you were to scan that QR code and then enter this F24 new, you get 25% off of that. So there you go. I'm plugging my book. But is there any questions anyone has?
Norm Sharp had a question. Does this program illustrate why Sierra Club resources, volunteer and staff, are largely focused on national lands and not state lands?
I would guess so, because I often tell my students, it's like if you were in a rock climbing gym and one wall was like sheer glass and the other wall, had the little bumps and rocks sticking out like a rock climbing wall does. That's federal land. Because of federal law, we have footholds. We have guaranteed, participation, guaranteed standing to sue. You can say, hey, this law is violating the National Forest Management Act, which is a really easy thing usually to show. About half of all federal logging projects in this period, they did a study of about a 10 or 15-year period. Over half of them were successfully challenged in court. So environmentalists have been able to get tremendous success by making the Forest Service live up to national environmental legislation. State land operates under very different legal framework. First of all, the laws aren't as protective. A lot of states don't even have laws anything like NIFMA or the Endangered Species Act. And you don't have a guaranteed kind of access to the courts. There's no foothold. And so you kind of be hitting your head against a brick wall. That said, there's a few fights that are more like popular mobilization. The fight in Tennessee over that wildlife area, I'm guessing the local Sierra Club was involved. We had a state park that in Wisconsin that the governor traded a key chunk in the heart of the park. He traded to Kohler, the plumbing manufacturer that is headquartered nearby. They were going to build a world-class golf course and they needed some of the state park. So he traded them this pristine sand dune ecosystem for a junky weed-filled lot on the other side of the park that they owned. That was so outrageous. Sierra Club got involved. The Wisconsin chapter got involved. So it does happen. There are Sierra Club chapters that are deeply involved in state lands, but it really pays off much more handsomely, your time and your organizing on federal land. That might all change if these emergencies that are being declared, these Trump bogus emergencies, actually are allowed by the courts. Then all these laws get bypassed and wiped out, and then who knows.
Okay, I'm going to call on Carolyn.
Okay. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yep.
Hi. Yeah, I'm Carolyn Kufel. I'm from I live in Missouri, St. Louis,
Mhm.
and I just really, really like this presentation. Thank you so much.
Oh, sure.
I'm
My pleasure.
interested in your book. I wanted to kind of say something positive about Missouri. It doesn't happen too often that we get to say this. But I don't know if you looked at Missouri's state forests and state parks,
Mhm.
but we have a pretty good system in that we have dedicated tax that covers both
Yes.
our
Yes.
state forests and then another one that covers our state parks. And that pretty much keeps it out of political shenanigans, not
Yes.
completely by any means, but and our state park sales tax is combined with a soils sales tax, which helps farmers deal with soil erosion and other, good farming practices that they get help to implement. And so combining those two, this went back to 1976 and it's been renewed many times. It's very popular.
Mhm.
We support our state parks and our farmers.
Yeah, notice when I was talking about states, I was qualifying it. Most states tend to, and there's a small
Yeah.
cluster of states that are really kind of doing things right. And Missouri is actually one of them, especially with how they fund. And that is priceless to have that dedicated funding line that is stable and it doesn't depend on the whims of legislators. There's something else that no state has, but some local governments, especially in Illinois, in the 1890s, Illinois created a system where local governments, counties mostly, could create special park taxing districts.
Mhm.
And I don't know if you guys have heard of the Cook County and the Lake County Forest Preserves. That 6 counties around Chicago have really massive. It's like 150,000 acres added up, and one in 10 acres in the Chicago's Cook County, second biggest county in the U.S.
Yeah, that was huge.
1 of 10 acres is
Yeah.
protected forest, and that's because these local governments have their own taxing authority apart from. So like I'm sorry, not the local government, the local forest preserve has its own tax line. It's a tiny little mill rate, but no one could touch it. And it just pumps resources into the forest and it's just the way it is. And it's not anything that has to be decided or cut over and over again. They only have one job to do, and that is to protect and run these forests. And this, by the way, those Cook County Forest Preserves is sort of where modern, at least on the eastern part of the country, where modern prairie and savanna restoration was first kind of implemented and figured out in the 1970s, because they had all this kind of resources to try to improve the habitat.
We'll take one more question, but we're out of time, but go ahead, Rhonda.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's
Sure.
fascinating. I think I need to buy your book because I didn't quite digest all those numbers.
Yeah, I only have 40 minutes.
Representative Randy Fine from the East Coast of Florida is proposing to take a bunch of our springs, something like 30 springs, maybe more, together with the Osceola National Forest and turn it into the 64th National Park. Now, I heard you say before that it's a bad deal to turn national parkland, I think, into state parkland, something like that. And I feel like I should be able to answer this question for myself right now. So apologies, but what would you think about that?
The opposite.
The opposite?
Well, I mean, I've heard a little bit about this. It's mostly federal land that would be transferred from the Forest Service to the Park Service. So that's kind of how Olympic National Park was created. It used to be chunks of Olympic National Forest. So that wouldn't be that unusual. We have precedent for that, where land is moved from one federal agency to another. But some of it seems like it's going to be Florida. It would be Florida land.
Yeah, I can't actually.
Florida is one of these states that really surprises me. For a red state, it does a really good job. It has acquired more land faster. since the 1950s in any of the 50 states. And it's it's like the fourth biggest chunk of state land. So it's not like necessarily that land would be taken better care of. Florida does a pretty good job. So I don't know. If you're from Florida, I leave that for you to decide. But either way, as long as it's protected, I think it'll be okay.
Dumb question. Revenue to the counties or to the state, how does that work? And is it uniform nationwide? Do state lands pay taxes or federal lands pay taxes? No.
Only Iowa of the 50 states collects county and local taxes on their public lands. All the other states, it's just like the federal government, the land is not taxed. And so for that reason, some states and the federal government have different schemes, and it's different in the different parts of the country. Sometimes it's a cut of the resources produced, like the timber. Sometimes it's straight out what's called payment in lieu of taxes. You just get some money from the federal or state government to for local governments to take the place of all that land. It keeps local populations from resenting being so much public land that they can't plow their roads and run their schools. I think that's critical. And anytime, and Republicans are threatening the federal version of that. And I think their idea is to get people to really dislike having public land in their counties.
Well, I mean, Karen, I'm sorry, I'll just be quick here. We're just leery of putting something under federal control under this administration, I think, mostly.
Yeah, in most years, that would be a safe bet. Everything's up for grabs now, so I can't say. But, you know, if this was 4 years ago, I'd say, oh, yeah, that would be great.
Thank you.
Yeah, as a national park, it would probably be pretty well protected, I think.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Oh,
We appreciate, Stephen, you're taking time and coming and talking to our group and answering questions.
Yeah, and if anyone has any specific questions, you could reach me. You just Google my name in Edgewood College, and you could probably find my email that way.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, take care.
And thank you, everybody, for joining. Next month, we have with us Dan Chu from the Sierra Club Foundation, and he's going to be talking about funding and public lands. And come with questions. He'll be happy to answer them. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Look forward to talking to you next month. And thanks again, Stephen. It was a great presentation.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Okay.